He was sitting on a bench in the park when he observed the girl watching him. She was a very pretty girl, and there was a silk scarf tied over her light blonde hair. She was currently reading a book, but there was a sketch pad and what looked like charcoal pencils beside her. It was Tuesday, September 1st, the first day of school, and the park had magically emptied of the rowdier element. What was left was a scattering of mothers with infants, a few old men sitting by the war memorial, and this girl, sitting in the dapple shade of a gnarled old elm. This is how we met Susan Norton, the doomed female protagonist of Salem's Lot in the novel. We meet her through the eyes of our main male protagonist, Ben Mears, and are as smitten with her as she is from the first moment. She's smart, witty, pretty, and very daring for a small-town girl who only wants to get out of said small town and start living her own life, even if she doesn't quite do it yet. Unfortunately, she's also the only female character among our merry band of vampire hunters, and because Stephen King was mirroring Dracula, she not only covers the role of Mina Harker, but also the role of poor, dumb Lucy Westerna. I'm AdalisaZ, and today we're going to talk a bit about another King's woman, the strong but flawed Susan Norton. Susan Norton is a very interesting early character of King, even if some people may want to classify her as badly written because she happens to die, and unfortunately the movie adaptations of Salem's Lot make her death all about Strucker and Barlow wanting to hunt Bear Mears, which for many people who haven't read the book would make her a refrigerated woman. First, this is something that happens a lot to King characters and plots. As the movie adaptations, good or bad, are better known than King's books, as well read as they are, well, people tend to blame King for things that he never wrote, and that is a bone of contention I have with a lot of critics of his work. Second, I went and asked Gail Simone, the woman who coined the term in the first place, on her opinions about it, the term being woman in a refrigerator. And while she told me that she didn't quite remember Susan Norton enough to give an opinion, there was a very nice conversation in the comments about how the most important part of the trope of a refrigerated woman is that at the end of the day, her death must be about the pain it will cause to the hero, not about her or anyone else not the hero, which is definitely not the case with Susan. Yes, her death hurts Ben, and all the heroes of course, because the heroes are her friends. But the actual reason for her death in the plot is completely about the plot itself, not about a simple shock value moment, and definitely not about Ben's story. With that in mind, let's start remembering a few things about how Salem's Lot was written. As I mentioned before, every time that King has talked about the process of how he wrote Salem's Lot, he goes to the most basic idea of, what if instead of England, Dracula had gone to a small town in Maine? In one of the forewords he had written from Salem's Lot, he calls the idea trying to combine Dracula and Tales of the Crypt and come out with Moby Dick. He's making fun of himself, by the way, for such high ideas. He's not thinking that Salem's Lot is Moby Dick. However, his main goal, as far as his words go, was to create a pessimistic balance to what he saw as Strucker's incredibly optimistic view of the world. Once again, in this foreword, he points out that at the end, Dracula is how the voice of science and reason managed to overcome the dark powers of the past, with a somewhat happy ending, which he didn't think would happen in modern era, most especially in a small New England town. In fact, we know that King does not have a very nice view of small New England towns, and we add that with the fact that during his early years King loved to be as cruel as possible to his characters and readers. It is not a surprise that he was thinking about something where the chances of the villain winning were incredibly high. In other words, every character in Salem's Lot was in danger of dying, be they male or female, and if young Stephen King had had his way and wrote plotting rather than seeing where the story took him, they probably would have all died, At a different time, we will talk about King really, really dislikes outlining and forcing a story to go the way he wants it to go instead of letting flow naturally. All of this is to say that while yes, Susan's death is painful for Ben, it was not to make him suffer. I'm going to hammer this a lot in this video, sorry about that. She dies because of her own actions, her own story, and more importantly, her own personal search for independence. So let's talk about Susan's life before we move on to her death. We met Susan at the same time as Ben does, in the paragraph I quoted at the beginning of the video. She's reading a book, one of the books that he has written to be precise, and having a quiet lunch away from her job. When she notices and recognizes him, she goes to him and, in an impulse which shows us Susan doesn't think things through, asks him to sign it for her, despite it being a library copy and out of print. This, more than her looks, although Ben immediately notices that she's pretty, not beautiful, pretty, is what makes Ben want to spend more time with her and know her better, which is how we get to know her far better too. We know that she has lived her whole life in Salem's Lot and was born on the year of the fire, a year where pretty much all of the town burned down except for the master house, which survived as the wind changed just before it could reach it. The master house, right now unknown to Ben at the time, is the lair of a vampire, and even back then it was house to horrible things, so it's a constant refrain that when we mention the fire, we should say that it should have burned the master house. But going back to Susan, she has an art master's from college, but like every single art major in the world can tell you, that's not an easy way to get money. In fact, she has sold very few pieces, mostly for a local cinema, and she is convinced that it was because the owner took pity on her and not because of her talent. So, Susan, to avoid the starving artist stereotype, is still living with her parents, which, in her own words, is the only reason why she is still alive. Here, of course, lies the biggest problem of Susan's life. Her parents. Or, more specifically, her mother, Anne. Because while Anne is not half as bad as Margaret White, at the very least, Anne has never been physically abusive to Susan, and let's be honest, the bar set by Margaret White as a bad mother is pretty high. But she is, and Norton, she is the second in a long life of abusive mothers in King's books. Susan knows her mother loves her, which is another thing that many of these abusive mothers have. They do love their children. The problem is how they show their love. And Anne in particular shows her love by trying to control every single step of Susan's life. Who she is, who she talks to, whom she dates, and this of course brings the first huge fight between them as Susan starts dating Ben instead of Floyd Tibbets, the man whom Anne prefers because he's a local. This is a funny case of Anne maybe having a small tiny point to a degree, because Ben is not really staying in town, and there is a long history of men coming to small towns, convincing a girl that they will marry them and then abandoning them, usually pregnant. Thing is, we, the readers, know that Ben is not the time to do that, and Ben in narration constantly warns himself about Susan, since he's not sure he loves her at first and he doesn't want to lead her on. But also, we know that Susan doesn't care for the romance part as much as she cares for the leaving town part. Because this is what moves Susan. She's not a naive girl in love with her favorite writer, no matter what the miniseries do, although she does grow to love Ben, tragically as it ends. But she's a woman who is looking for her own independence and her own place in the world. She even tells this to Ben. As long as he takes her all the way to New York, she's fine with never seeing each other again afterwards. Which is why, then, he, noticing how serious she is about her career, starts giving her advice on how to really make the best out of leaving town instead of just packing her bags and leave. He, in this sense, becomes more of an artist mentor than a romance partner, even if they do actually become romantic partners and they do have sex a couple of times before she dies. Unfortunately, vampires and overbearing mothers will get in the way of what could have been a very, very bright future for Susan had she been able to leave Salem's Lot. A very common misconception helped along by the 1979 and the 2004 miniseries is that Susan is in love with Ben and that informs all her actions, and it's even what gets her turned into a vampire because Barlow specifically wants to punish Ben for trying to oppose him. I have said already, yes, Susan is in love with Ben, but that is not what informs all her actions, and I think I put it clear before. But it is true that in the novel, Susan gets left behind in the master's house as a message from Barlow to the fearless vampire hunters that he will kill all of their loved ones. Yes. However, Susan is not the only casualty of that situation, and it's more important that she's left behind for all of the vampire hunters. Barlow is not sure that Ben will be in that group as they were divided at the time. And again, I have the feeling that had King not been bouncing his ideas from Dracula, where one of the most important moments is how Van Helsing tells Arthur that he should be the one who kills Lucy to release her soul from the curse of vampirism because he loves her, then Susan might have been killed by someone else. Also, the stakes of letting Barlow go, the letting Barlow win in this case, are a lot heavier, so Ben does not get to have that moment that Jonathan gets of saying that if Mina turns into a vampire, he will let her turn her instead of killing her. But again, Susan is left behind as a message for the group. Because of all the group, at that point, and in fact I would dare to say in the whole novel, the only one who is a personal enemy to Barlow, the only one that Barlow actually hates as a person, is Mark. One of the main examples is because of all the I will kill you and your loved ones scenes, the only kill that Barlow actually does with his hands. In fact, the only kill we see Barlow do in the whole novel is of Mark Petty's parents. But I will leave my theories of how Mark, being the child, is the real antagonist for Barlow for a different video. Going back to Susan, yes, she loved Ben, but as I said, her main and most important goal is to get the hell out of Salem's Lot because there's nothing she would like less than end up like her mom, a housewife with no dreams except for keeping her daughter in the nest with a job that gives her no creative outlet. In her own words, she rather tried her luck in New York at least once, willing even to accept that she could end up coming back with her tail between her legs, before just giving up for conformity, and she admits to herself that yeah, she may be using Ben for that. So, why does Susan end up turned into a vampire? Because Ben's obsession with the Marsden house is getting on the way of her getting out of Salem's Lot with him. Yes, she knows that she has to wait for Ben to finish his novel before Ben decides to leave the town. But from her point of view, he starts getting really, really obsessed with the idea that there are vampires in the house, and so he wants to keep investigating, he wants to keep researching, and that means that the day when he actually leaves is getting farther and farther away. Which means that the day that she can leave is getting farther and farther away. At this point, Susan has already left her house. She is wanting to get away from her mother, but more importantly here, she is not leaving to live with Ben. She actually rents a room for herself somewhere apart from where Ben is renting his own room, away from her parents. So yeah, she's starting to move out of her mom's shadow, which her mom doesn't like a lot. So, listening to all the theories that men and now Matt have about vampires, she gets into her head to go alone to investigate the master house to prove that there are no such things as vampires, and that probably the only thing that there are two very weird gay guys, because yeah, she has that suspicion, that may or may not be serial killers. The wisdom of going alone to a house where she suspects there are serial killers notwithstanding, If they hadn't been vampires, she might have been okay. There she meets Mark, who was also trying to investigate. But the thing is here, Mark knows that the master house is a nest of vampires. By this time, Mark has already met Danny Glick transformed into a vampire, so he knows what the true danger is. Susan doesn't. And as Mark is trying to convince Susan to get a stake and to protect herself, that's when they are captured by Strucker, Barlow's human servant, who leaves them for food for Barlow for when he wakes up. However, he leaves them in different rooms. In short, Susan is going to be the main course, and because he's younger and Barlow and Strucker have very, very nasty tastes, Mark is going to be the dessert. This is why Mark survives, by the way, because he had an acute interest in Houdinian escapism and because he was in a different room. Susan, unfortunately, was tied and unconscious in the same room as Barlow's coffin, so as soon as the sun set, she was dead. But once again, I have to repeat, she was left as food. At this point, Strucker didn't know who she was. He had no idea that she was dating Ben, and he had no idea that Ben was actually trying to kill Barlow. So there is no reason to think that her death was in order to punish Ben. Susan is a very good example of a tragic woman in King's works who could have very well have been the main character in the same book had King decided to go a different route halfway the writing process. Personally, I would love an adaptation or retelling where she is not turned, but Ben is, so the book starts with the woman, or the woman pretending to be the man to hide herself from those chasing them, and the boy, rather than the man and the boy, but I digress. Free idea, Netflix. She also should be remembered as much as more than just one more lady in distress or Ben's romantic interest, even if her life and story arc was cut short. And a very good reason to check out Salem's Lot, the book, again. Just don't open the windows no matter who knocks on them, and never let go of your symbol of fate. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica, and Ali Riley, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Song, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos will not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/AdalisaZ, with a link in the description, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or, if you prefer a one-off offer, add coffee. With each $1, you will get a mention on the next video I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. Now, we're going back to that tiny cabin in the woods I mentioned before, where 4 friends will hate the fact that they are also good Samaritans in the very surreal Dreamcatcher. Later, however, we will come back to the ladies of King, as the Overlook Hotel has more than a few ladies that are very interesting to get to know.